Yeah, so it's a great pleasure now to introduce Lorenzo Chiesa to you, our last speaker, the last lecture, and we have been talking a lot and discussing a lot melancholy and mourning, and now Lorenzo brings a new term in: anxiety, absence as a presence elsewhere. Lorenzo is a philosopher, and a philosopher who has extremely published and taught on psychoanalysis. For instance, his books on psychoanalysis include Subjectivity and Otherness, MIT Press 2007. This came out by the German publishing house Neue Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher in Frankfurt under the title of Subjektivität und Andersheit in 2022. Then we have Lacan and Philosophy, repressed 2014. Then the Not To, Logic and God in Lacan, MIT Press, again 2016. Another title is The Virtual Point of Freedom, Northwestern University Press, 2016. And he just recently completed a new book together with Adrian Johnston titled God is Undead, Psychoanalysis for Unbelievers. And also I can announce that this will come out at the Neue Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher in Frankfurt at the end of the year under the title Agnostischer Atheismus. And we will have it then at the library, no worries. And currently he's writing a monograph on Lacan and Badiou entitled Letter and Event, Lacan, Badiou, and the Future of Psychoanalysis. So he's writing a lot, but he teaches also as a senior lecturer in philosophy at Newcastle University, where he is also serving as co-convener of the faculty research group in critical theory and praxis. He was previously professor of modern European thought at the University of Kent, where he founded and directed the Center for Critical Thought. And he held visiting positions at universities and institutions in the United Kingdom, continental Europe, the United States, Asia, and also he has been visiting the Freud Museum in London, of course, but also the Freud Dreams Museum in St. Petersburg. So please join me in a warm welcome for Lorenzo. And so we have a last hour for Lacan again.
First of all, let me warmly thank Daniela and all the other organizers for a very, very kind invitation. It is not only a pleasure, I should say, but also an honor to be speaking, I dare to say, at the real Freud Museum. I'm used to speaking at the museum in London. No offense taken in St. Petersburg, but this is the first time. So I'm really honored. Thank you very much. Now, Jacques Lacan has a detailed theory of anxiety which culminates in Seminar 10. Lacan deals with phenomenological, structural, and ontological, if not ethical and political aspects of anxiety. In this paper, I will mostly focus on the phenomenological aspect and in part the structural, as both inextricable from absence, lack, and the void. So what do we experience when we are anxious? This mundane but also philosophically charged question obviously has direct implications on the clinic of psychoanalysis. It does so in terms of both how the analyst understands phenomena such as depersonalisation or panic attacks or more diffused absent-mindedness, and how anxiety is, at least in Lacanian psychoanalysis, constructively leveraged upon in the treatment itself, if not its end. The least we can say about anxiety, according to Lacan, is that first, anxiety is anxiety of the void, and fundamentally defensive. And second, anxiety has both structural and metastructural, or if you wish, phenomenological connotations. That is to say, anxiety concerns both the subject of the unconscious and the self-conscious ego. Better said, in my own words, anxiety lies at the fleeting point of the mutual indistinction between the subject of the unconscious and the self-conscious ego. To condense Lacan's main tenet, on the one hand, anxiety about the danger of the void, a danger which is presented by the other's desire, is what ontogenetically for the child causes a structure as yet undivided between the unconscious and self-consciousness to establish fantasy, and thus the division between the unconscious and self-consciousness. One aspect of anxiety. On the other hand, anxiety about the representation of such danger of the void, an anxiety in which self-consciousness temporarily becomes conscious of the unconscious or temporarily lifts primary repression, is what phenomenologically suspends the split that makes the subject of the unconscious and the ego possible. So anxiety makes the split between the two possible and then suspends it. This is the main point. Yet, the end product of this suspension of the division between the unconscious and self-consciousness is for Lacan to immediately, through anxiety, reinforce repression. In this latter sense, reinforcing repression, anxiety stands for Lacan says, following closely Freud, a warning signal aimed at what? At preventing the fixing of the void, the catastrophic fixing of the void. Strictly speaking, according to Lacan, purely structural anxiety, which he tends to associate, if not identify, with the Freudian notion of trauma, is such pure anxiety, such only retrospectively from the stance of phenomenological anxiety. Phenomenological anxiety in the sense of, you can put it like a panic attack itself. Let us try to unpack this difficult junction, what I've just said. First, Lacan is nonetheless adamant that anxiety can only accurately be investigated with respect to structure, not just phenomenologically as a lived experience. This is, we could say, the starting point in Seminar 10, Anxiety. Lacan states that there is, quote, an essential relation of anxiety to the other's desire as a structural relation, end of quote. To stress the already structural dimension of this relation, Lacan adds, quote, that anxiety is at the beginning, interesting, italics, anxiety is at the beginning of all defenses. It's prior to the division between the unconscious, the existence of the unconscious, and self-consciousness. But, complication, anxiety is thereby for Lacan also structural in the sense that anxiety acquires its own structure, which is precisely the structure of fantasy. Quote, the structure of anxiety is not far from this essential structure that is called fantasy. They are quite the same, end of quote. We should then specify that the structure of anxiety as the structure of fantasy is as such, on closer inspection, already metastructural. There are too many levels of structure here already. Fantasy is, for Lacan, metastructure's structure. That is to say, the kernel of the subject of the unconscious. The other side of which is the phenomenological lived experience of the self-conscious ego. what Lacan nicely calls the orography of anxiety, therefore amounts to 3 layers, not 2. Structurally different, but also all structural in a broad sense and closely connected in a retrospective way. So, A, the purely structural anxiety about the danger of the void, which makes the child become a subject, interestingly. B, the meta-structural and still anxiety-inducing containment of this primordial danger in the unconscious fantasy. And then C, the more mundane, meta, we could call it, representation of this danger for the ego, for the self-conscious ego, in phenomenological anxiety, let's say panic attacks. So focusing on the level of anxiety qua fantasy, the second above, the question then is, the straightforward question, how, for Lacan, can fantasy function as both a containment of the danger of the void and anxiety-inducing? There seems to be a tension. This is the case insofar as, qua fantasy, Lacan says, anxiety is already framed. So the kernel of the unconscious, which is fantasy, is the framing of anxiety. This is the big point. Or better, it frames the purely structural anxiety about the other's desire, qua danger of the void. Yet as such, as a framing, that is, Lacan insists, a defense. Remember, it lies at the beginning of all defenses. Anxiety also retrospectively, quote, constitute the hostile, he says, the hostile as such, end of quote. So let us bear in mind that on the level of purely structural anxiety, the child is not yet a subject. In fantasy, the child instead emerges as subject only by, quote, making itself be the object in its own fantasy, end of quote. So, on the one hand, this amounts to, Lacan says, making oneself the object of one's own fantasy. This amounts to the bait, quote, with which the subject, the child, controls the other's desire, end of quote. On the other hand, obviously, intuitively, such objectification, which is necessary for subjectivity, proves unbearable, and the structure of anxiety qua fantasy is repressed. Here Lacan, interestingly, resumes Freud. The Wolfman's dream epitomizes for Lacan everything I've just said, in a nutshell. The gaze of the wolves keeps the other's desire at bay. But at the same time, the gaze as object A in Lacanian jargon, the gaze as object is the subject's own gaze staring at the subject as a split, barred subject. And that is what constitutes the hostile as such. Developing on this, still in relation to the Wolfman, Lacan speaks of anxiety qua fantasy in terms of, quote, a painting that comes to be placed in the frame of a window. He goes on and says, this absurd technique, a painting over the frame of a window, aims, Lacan says, at not seeing what is seen through the window, end of quote. What is not to be seen, I would expand, is precisely what purely structural anxiety, pre-subjectivity, is about. And what is it about? It is about the contiguity between the mark, or you can call it the letter, technically for Lacan, the unary trait, the trait in its a-specific genericity, and the void. The trait and the void are one and the same, and they coalesce in the other's desire. And this is the danger of the void. In this defensive sense, in fantasy, the other's desire faints, Lacan says, and becomes the subject's desire. The frame of the window, go back to the Wolfman, is covered by the painting of fantasy on which there are wolves on the branches of a tree, and the subject's desire is played out on this painting. There is a subject. The child becomes a subject. But concomitantly, the object of the subject's desire, the wolf's gaze, is the object of the subject's desire only as, quote, the object that I am, to the extent that the object exiles me from my subjectivity, end of quote. This is the tension. Now, having said all this, there is also undoubtedly a plain phenomenology of anxiety for Lacan, our main topic today, with which phenomenology the psychoanalytic clinic practically deals, and through which the multi-layered structure of anxiety can be detected and reconstructed. More to the point, phenomenologically, according to a well-known motto, anxiety is, Lacan says, that which does not deceive. We should immediately stipulate the following. Phenomenologically in the sense of the psychoanalytic cabinet, but also everyday life. Phenomenologically, anxiety, the ego's anxiety about the representation of the danger of the void, which was ontogenetic, is not only that which does not deceive about its structure, but also and especially about what structure is to cool. So anxiety gives you the being of structure, to simplify for Lacan. And what is structure to cool? For Lacan, fundamentally, it is the unary trait, the letter, the cut, as such, contiguous with the void. There is no letter without the void. And this is the danger of the void which anxiety tries to contain. The other famous Lacanian refrain, according to which anxiety amounts to, interestingly, the lack of lack, or absence of absence, should also be understood in this context. Outside of such context, it proves very misleading. Let me inspect this point. Lacan argues that phenomenologically, everyday life, quote, anxiety emerges when something appears at the place minus phi. The place minus phi, let's aside the jargon, the place minus phi is the place, he says, of absence, of the absence of the phallus, if you wish. Namely, to be much more concrete, it is the place where in self-consciousness every object of demand, we demand, is grasped in what it lacks. I want this, I want that, I want that. So, I repeat this point, quite important. The place minus phi is the place of absence, of the absence of the phallus, namely, to be more concrete, the place where in self-consciousness every object of demand is grasped in what it lacks. Bluntly put, no object is really satisfactory for the subject. Commentators thus tend to conclude that if in anxiety something appears in the place of absence, where every object is as such a lacking object, then anxiety amounts to the lack of lack, as something. And I think this is a mistake for Lacanians. That something would be what? The phallus, as an absolute object. That is, the subject's reattachment with the detached, lost, partial object, the breast, feces, voice, and here especially the gaze. But that something, as on closer inspection, the apparition of the thing, supposed thing with a capital T, when reached, would prove to be nothing other than the object as nothing of the object, and hence the dissolution of the subject. According to this kind of wrong reading, intra-Lacanian wrong reading, which is rarely unfolded to the logical conclusion I'm here deducing and hence rests on unsolvable tensions, anxiety would therefore stand for a catastrophic reaction that fixes the void. In a sense, I'm trying to challenge this mainstream understanding of anxiety. Anxiety is to simplify, a defense against the fixing of the void. It is not the fixing of the void. The rest of my paper will be on this point. Lacan's point is here quite different and far more subtle. Anxiety for Lacan does indeed emerge when something appears at the place of absence. Yet, in line with Freud's latest theory of anxiety, that something is for Lacan as well just a signal. In one instance, Lacan nicely speaks of the danger exclamation mark signal with respect to the subject's approaching the other's desire. In my own words, anxiety as a signal coincides with the representation for the ego of the trait, the exclamation mark of danger, if you wish, at the moment when the ego is threatened by the proximity of the other, by the representation of the other's desire as the danger of the void, of the fixing of the void. Now, I will delve into this, focus, zoom on. We must here take a step back and proceed a bit more slowly. To begin with, we should note that Lacan never, against Lacanian commentators and analysts, Lacan never literally speaks of anxiety as a lack of lack or absence of absence. This should already caution us against a substantialist interpretation for which, by means of a double negation, absence of absence, we would be dealing in anxiety with something, or even the thing, however destructive and catastrophic they may be. Importantly, Lacan does not fail to stress that anxiety has nothing to do with a sort of being given in its immediacy, like chaos. It's not chaos, it's quite the opposite. Regarding anxiety, Lacan speaks instead of how, quote, lack comes to be lacking, end of quote. So instead of a lack of lack, it's a lack that comes to be lacking, end of quote. This is not a minor or sophistic distinction. The least we can infer is that some sort of movement or oscillation is at stake in anxiety. More precisely, in anxiety, on the one hand, something indeed appears at the place of absence, at the place of lack or absence. But on the other hand, and crucially, what appears at the place of absence is, quote Lacan, title of my paper, commanded by a presence that is elsewhere. Such presence that is elsewhere, we are told, is the object in the function that it fulfills in fantasy. So, strictly speaking, the object A, if you want, but you can just call it the object. The object is not what appears in anxiety, which would entail a catastrophic fixing of the void. What appears in anxiety is instead what Freud referred to as the Unheimlich. So this is really interesting because Lacanians forgot about it. Anxiety is not a catastrophic fixing of the void. Anxiety is almost synonymous with the structure of the Unheimlich. What appears in anxiety is what Freud referred to as the Unheimlich, the uncanny. As Lacan indicates, the uncanny is not catastrophic. The uncanny still falls under the aegis, he says, of phenomena, weird phenomena, uncanny phenomena, as epitomized by the image of the double, that is to say, of the other, staring at me with my own gaze, as nonetheless at a distance from me. But this is also fantasy for Lacan. You see? So you have an almost equation between anxiety and fantasy here. Let me repeat and further scrutinize this passage. So, on the one hand, the place of absence, the everyday place of absence, that is to say, the place where every object of demand is grasped in what it lacks, the place, we could say, of the unsatisfiable self-conscious ego is, Lacan says, our, in German, Heim, home. It is the domain of the pleasure principle. As such, Lacan says, it does represent the absence where we are. On the other hand, in phenomena of Unheimlichkeit or anxiety, such customary, normal absence reveals itself or presents itself for what it is qua absence, Lacan says. So the point here is that this absence cannot be reduced against many Lacanians to some thing resulting from an absence of absence, some capital T thing that follows, which is eventually nothing at all. Rather, what absence is reveals itself, quote Lacan, as a presence elsewhere, namely the presence of the object elsewhere that makes this place, my usual place, the place of absence. More concretely, in anxiety, the image of the double, the image that possesses the detached part object, makes the subject appear as object in the place of the other's desire. It thus makes the subject appear as, Lacan says, non-autonomous. And this is why anxiety is anxiety-inducing. So it is a defense and anxiety-inducing. And the two sides are one and the same thing. But crucially, as I just said, this is simultaneously this non-autonomy of the object seeing themselves as object in the other. This non-autonomy is simultaneously an extreme defense. The subject sees itself elsewhere as object, seeing the subject back. This is, in a sentence, the phenomenology of anxiety. The subject sees itself elsewhere as an object at the place of the other's desire and the danger of the void, seeing the subject back. This is what the Wolfman's dream for Lacan would epitomize. In anxiety, the subject is not the object as nothing of the object, but the other side of the object. That is to say, the object as placing of the void, of the other's desire as danger of the void, or better, the object as a, again, trait. In this restricted sense, anxiety, Lacan says, is not without an object, yet such double negation, not without, claims something quite different from claiming that anxiety straightforwardly has an object qua something resulting from the lack of lack. We are juxtaposing and opposing two different kinds of double negation, if you want to be more philosophical. The bad one is lack of lack equal presence, bad Lacanianism. The other one is lack comes to be lacking, and that's an extreme form of psychic defense. In this restricted sense, the object A, might be said to appear in anxiety. The object appears as what? As uncanny, in the fleeting apparition of the unconscious fantasy in subconsciousness that suspends for an instant both the unconscious fantasy and the subconscious ego. But again, the object only appears as a cut, as a trait that remains detached from the subject. Thus, going myself beyond Lacan a bit here, if structure for Lacan as such ultimately amounts to the trait and the void being the same thing, then anxiety itself proves not entirely honest about what structure truly is. Now, I come to the final part of my paper. All I've said, can further be unraveled by comparing anxiety with another crucial notion of the psychoanalytic clinic, that is to say, the so-called passage to the act. So everything I've said can be unraveled by comparing and contrasting, especially, anxiety with the passage to the act, which passage to the act, for Lacan, instead, unlike anxiety, catastrophically fixes the void. The main point at stake is that, contrary to what occurs in anxiety, the passage to the act presupposes, quote Lacan, the subject's absolute identification with the object, this object A, to which the subject reduces itself, end of quote. So, anxiety, there's still a distance between subject and object, which generates the uncanny, it's weird. On the other hand, with the passage to the act, there's an absolute identification of the subject with the object, which more philosophically means a fixing of the void and a catastrophic dissolution of the subject. Put simply, what unleashes the passage to the act is that, unlike in anxiety, there is no longer, again, any distance between subject and object. There is, quote Lacan, an immediate linking of the subject with what it is, the subject, as object in the other, end of quote. More precisely, like anxiety, the passage to the act concerns the representation for the ego of the danger of the void, qua others' desire, and the suspension of the division between the ego and the unconscious fantasy. But such suspension, such passage, namely the fleeting apparition of the unconscious fantasy in subconsciousness, is played out otherwise in the passage to the act. In the passage to the act, the subject again identifies with the object as nothing of the object, and not as in anxiety with the object as a cut, as a trait, as a mark, taken also as a count. This is a one that undoes itself. Think about it. This is a one which is not our Platonic unity. So, I repeat, the subject in the passage to the act identifies with the object as nothing of the object, and not as in anxiety with the object as a trait, mark, letter, cut, taken as a count that looks back at the subject. That is the extreme defense. Or, as Lacan has it, commenting on Freud's case of the so-called young homosexual woman, a paradigmatic case of passage to the act for Lacan, the subject in the passage to the act, quote, feels definitively identified with the object, and by the same token psychologically rejected, dejected, out of scene, end of quote. So, the catastrophic act of the passage to the act that realizes this out of the scene, think of the window, thereby amounts in the passage to the act to letting oneself fall, neither common, which, as you know, in the case of the young homosexual woman treated by Freud, concretely means jumping off a bridge, here in Vienna, by the way. Apparently, Lacan spent months trying to locate the bridge, but...
I can tell you, the name of the bridge is actually very interesting. The name of the bridge is Kettenbrückengasse, so it means chains. It was the bridge of the chains. That's where she threw herself down.
Even more evocative, the chains of the signifier.
There are holes in a chain.
Let me conclude. So, two main points should retain our attention in Lacan's distinguishing the passage to the act as fixing catastrophically the void from anxiety, and so better grasp anxiety as anxiety about the danger of the void. First, in the passage to the act, the subject lets itself fall into the other's desire, qua void. Or better, as Lacan stresses, letting oneself fall is the act of the passage to the act. The subject actively jumps out of the window of fantasy, my own words. Second, in close relation to this, the passage to the act as a catastrophic destruction of phenomenology, of metastructure and structure, has also and especially implications on the level we earlier referred to as the purely ontogenetic for the child structural level, that is to say, the level of the trait prior to fantasy. Propelled by the subject's identification with the object as nothing of the object, the jump out of the window of fantasy into the abyss, the jump as itself, think about it, a jump, the jump enacts in the passage to the act, the trait being the same thing as the void. The void is thus fixed, catastrophic dissolution of the subject. Through the jump, the trait fixes itself as a void. So what is normally the contiguity, the dialectic between the trait and the void, here becomes the same thing. The trait fixes itself as void. Lacan speaks here of something that pertains to structure as such, quote unquote. Slightly correcting Lacan, I would say the passage to the act is therefore what absolutely does not deceive, not anxiety. Anxiety is what does not deceive. Actually, what does not absolutely deceive, if you want to be more Lacanian than Lacan, is the passage to the act, not anxiety, which is a defense. But at the unacceptable, so you have like truth somehow, there's an epistemological element, that which doesn't deceive, the passage to the act. But it does not deceive only at the unacceptable cost of losing what? The subject and structure itself. As a philosopher, this is quite important, my last point. The fixing of the void, from a Lacanian perspective, does not award us structure qua the void. Not to mention the void as such, but simply indifference. In stark opposition to this, what is the end product of the passage to the act? Indifference. In stark opposition to all this, quote Lacan, in anxiety, the subject is very much interested in what is most intimate of the subject. End of quote. Furthermore, despite its defensive function and its being not entirely honest, anxiety, quote, opens the subject up, letting appear, Lacan says, the unexpected, the visit, and potentially the piece of good news. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And so, I am not a Lacanian, but I was completely impressed by also your performativity, but sometimes a little bit confused when you talked about the subconscious and not the unconscious, but this is something just I was remarking. So I'm not a Lacanian, but I know there are several colleagues among the audience, and I would like to ask you.
Maybe
Yeah.
I could get back to you.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I guess like the distinction between subconscious and unconscious is not really a Lacanian distinction, but what I was aiming at in the context of anxiety is that for Lacan, you could say there are two levels of the unconscious.
Okay.
So there is like
Lacan would talk about the subconscious.
doesn't talk. No.
Yeah.
But the point is like quite clear if you look at things ontogenetically from the child's perspective. So the question is also the genesis of structure.
Yeah.
So in a sense, you have, if you want to put it like that, a pre-unconscious unconscious where signifiers are just marks.
Yeah.
And that is not what entails a subject, like the child naming themselves. I am me, you are you. It's vaguely pre-Oedipal, if you want to put it in Kleinian terms.
Because if you translate it back to German, unterbewusst, it's rather a signal that somebody has no idea of psychoanalytic terminology and that he is really using the wrong vocabulary. So this is why I was confused by it. Yeah. So, but you were, regarding the wrong reading, which you accorded to colleagues or Lacanian colleagues. So I would like to invite everybody in the audience, but of course, especially the Viennese Lacanians to. Of St. Petersburg, of course, to have first reactions. If you share this impression or readings. Or
Well, okay, I start from my impression. I recollected my favorite phrase from Jean-François Lyotard's theoretical terror. So thank you very much for it, and it was really very, very, very deep. And this is one thing. Another, I'm very thankful for criticizing Lacanians. The more I read Lacan, the less I like Lacanians. Well, I know. That's why I was pretty sure that you. I have not a Lacanian probably question. Actually, I have two. One question is when we say that anxiety is the only one affect which doesn't deceive us. I remember this from the 10th seminar. Somehow I have a question why in the theory of affects we don't say it about the shame. which is also a very basic affect which connects us with the other, and it's already from the 11th seminar. And if you don't mind, the other question is, I didn't expect you mentioned at least three times panic attacks. Could you say it's a contemporary psychological approach to anxiety, if it's something new, or you could consider it from the Lacanian perspective as when Lacan says the way to understand anxiety is Unheimlich, and maybe these panic attacks, this new term would be elaborated.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Victor. Starting from the second question, yeah, I mean, I was aware that it was a bit of provocation to bring in such a wrongly overloaded phrase, panic attacks, in a very technical Lacanian paper. But I think this follows from close conversations with close friends who are practicing analysts. And a Lacanian analyst, well, an analyst in general, receives people in analysis that most of the times, I would say statistically, do not know much about analysis and might be, among other things, fighting with what they call panic attacks. So in a sense, like, if we do not create a link from this basic demand, I'm suffering from panic attacks, such as, or I'm impotent, same thing, right? If we don't take that verbatim somehow and start from there and meet halfway with the highly sophisticated theory I tried to describe, we are lost. So my point is, like, anxiety can be treated by means of a very detailed, in Lacanian case, conceptual apparatus, but taking into consideration also what the analysant brings in. And I'm really making a joke here, but in a sense, like, the reply would be like, panic attacks, not such a bad thing. If you tell me you were going to jump off of a bridge in Vienna, that's a bit worse, I'm really simplifying things, But the idea of anxiety being a signal about the proximity of the other's desire, which could have potentially catastrophic existential effects, such as attempted suicide, can be itself, I think, related to practice only if we start with an even more banal take on what anxiety is. So a panic attack. Yeah. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to put together the uber theoretical with the very mundane, like the very mundane clinical here.
May I ask you something too?
Let's get back to the Kettenbrückengasse, to the homosexual patient, right? Isn't it, I'm not sure if my understanding is too simple, but wasn't it the big difference between Lacan and object relation and whatever is that the anxiety doesn't emerge from the loss of an object, but from the meeting exactly of the object you desire to meet, right? And this is exactly what happens to the homosexual patient, to Zonka or Greta or whatever. It is the moment, quote, she panics, yeah, if I may, just for you, is the moment where her desire to want to meet the father and for the father to see her with La Cocotte. And the shame, that's true. That's when, at the moment of meeting her own desire is what makes her then jump the passage à l'acte to the bridge. And and I always find very interesting the signifier of that bridge, So.
And also the case itself, I think it should be the sixth case officially. I mean, it's so deep.
Oh, it is incredible. It is. Yeah. I don't. Have you read?
It's just not a reading group. It's an incredible text. Yeah.
Did you read the Gerovici book on it? I think she has one of the best descriptions of it. Yeah, Patricia.
Thank you for the question.
Not.
The crux of the matter here,
Following Lacan would be to say that anxiety and the passage to the act share the same structure but the position of the object. So there is a kind of like losing of the subconscious ego, to simplify. But the position of the object is different in one and the other. That is to say, even more simply, I think Lacan would argue that in the case of the young homosexual woman treated by Freud, that was not anxiety. That was directly a passage to the act.
Right.
And what is structurally the difference that makes Lacan say something like that very abstractly? Concerning the case. Abstractly, the difference is what I try to underline. In the passage to the act, there is a kind of trembling of the subject-object relation, like in anxiety, but unlike in anxiety, in the passage to the act for Lacan, there is a full identification with the object. Let's say it's as if the wolfman would not be staring at himself with his own gaze, which is the wolf's gaze, but he would be identifying with that. This is a simplification, but I think this is the crux of the matter. And that's why anxiety is an extreme or most basic defense for Lacan, like for Freud at the end of the day, as a signal. So I see myself as object in the other, and that is unbearable, because that's objectification. But, you know, I see myself back, and a distance is preserved. In the passage to the act, same structure, but there's a full identification with this.
Oh, that's helpful.
And another example I didn't have time to mention, Lacan uses a lot Oedipus Colonus, and Lacanians actually always get the same quotes, but not this one, which is about anxiety. And he says, anxiety is like seeing oneself for one instant after one has lost one's eyesight. So like in Oedipus Colonus, his own gaze stares back after he blinds himself at him for the last time. And that is not a catastrophic fixing of the void, it is a signal about what might happen. So one could, after this, actually jump off the bridge. But I think clinically for Lacan, it is to say, if you tell me I'm going to jump off the bridge because I'm ashamed of, you know, like the lady I'm sleeping with, like has a bad reputation, my dad, etc. That's serious, in a sense. Whereas with anxiety, I think he's trying to say that there is a clinic where instead one can leverage that anxiety to turn it into my conclusion, his conclusion, a piece of good news. So the whole question is like how to go beyond anxiety without reinforcing defenses, again, repression, because it's basically, you say, a suspension of primary repression that reinforces repression, Lacan says, anxiety. So you don't want to end up with a passage to the act, which lifts repression catastrophically. So the whole question, this huge question in terms of the end of the treatment in Lacanian analysis, it is how to go beyond, let's say, passive anxiety, but not reaching the stage of the passage to the act. And here, a lot of like dear friends, Lacanian, even like Slavoj, you know, make a mistake when you start talking ethically about the passage to the act as the ethics of psychoanalysis. Antigone is not far away, in a sense. That is problematic, hugely problematic for me. The passage to the act is not an ethical act. It's a suicidal act. And this is where, like, you know, my friends, close friends and colleagues, I think it's a trope which is still there and it's problematic. Philosophically, you cannot think ethics by the passage to the act. You can think ethics, simplifying, by means of an appropriation of anxiety, to put it bluntly.
Isn't it not too far?
I'm sorry, too far from what Victor said at the very beginning, when time is out of joint and space, one could sort of say, is out of joint, when that's when the passage est l'acte. Huh? I'm sorry, you wanted to say something?
Just a new question, yeah. Thanks, that was very interesting and dense. I was just wondering, since we were reading through Seminar 10 together, actually, and Lacan is quite brutal with Freud in the seminar, I think. I mean, especially in the reading of the Jeune Homosexuel. But I guess my question is methodological, meta-methodological, but in moving from a metapsychological theory of the act, or sorry, pardon me, that was a slip, of the affect in Freud, Hemming, Symptom, and Angst, to moving towards this more structural account of anxiety in Lacan in the 1960s, of what from and of Freud remains, I mean, in this theory of anxiety. And I wonder if these three levels that you schematically outline between, you know, the purely structural phenomenological structure and then metastructure, is this metastructural level attempting to compensate something that's lacking in Freud? I mean, obviously there's no formalization there, which you explicitly gesture toward in your presentation. So I was just wondering, I guess the question's twofold. What is Freudian in Lacan at the end of the day here, and what is the metastructural level doing?
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, for those of you who are not Lacanians, I think like seminar 10 is probably, you're right, one of the first places. So he has already had like 10 seminars, and there will be, depending on how you count them, Lacanians have not even decided whether there are 26 or 27. That's another story. But it's the first place where Lacan starts being quite critical of Freud in seminar 10. But I think he's actually still defending, and he will keep on defending Freud, if you take the latest Freudian theory of anxiety. It's an inhibition symptom anxiety. So what Freud, forget about like the earlier theories of anxiety. That's to be left aside for Lacan. But the crux of the matter for Lacan is already, I mean, Freud already got the point. Anxiety is a signal that works as a defense. So the problem, to be more Freudian, where even on this point Lacan criticizes slightly Freud, is to say that from a Lacanian perspective, you cannot say that that signal is internal to the ego. Because in a sense, what I try to explain is that actually that signal for Lacan, the signal of anxiety, is actually a suspension of the very division that makes you a conscious, unconscious subject. Because it suspends the fundamental fantasy, which is, for Lacanians, the kernel of the unconscious. Second question is the difficult questions. So structure, it goes back to actually, I suppose what Daniela was asking, because if you speak of three levels, then you are almost inevitably brought into thinking also of a subconscious or pre-conscious. No. So, first explanation, I would say metastructure is phenomenology and the subconscious ego. Right? But that structure, so in a sense, like, you have a structure in the making, the level of the contiguity between the mark and the void, which is not just for the child, it goes on, even right now. Like, that's a matter of double inscription in Freud, for instance. Let's leave that aside. And then the level of what I call metastructure is on, at the same time, is completely contiguous with subconsciousness and what you could call philosophical phenomenology. So the whole point is to say that there is, let's put it like that. The whole point is to say that you don't start, I'm really simplifying here, but from an orthodox non-Millerian Lacanian perspective, I think you cannot say that the unconscious precedes self-consciousness. This is the crux of the matter in Lacan. Only when you have the establishment of fantasy, you have the division between the self-conscious ego and the unconscious, which is nothing but the structure of fantasy. Of course, retrospectively, you could say the child was a human being, a human animal, far before what in Freudian jargon would be the Oedipus. But technically, you cannot call pre-Oedipal phases the unconscious for Lacan. So you see, like, it's a two-tiered structure, but retroactively, it's a three-tiered structure. Does it make sense? We are really touching on
fantasy. I think you said it was the meta, or it's the metastructure of structure. Exactly. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I won't colonize, so.
Okay, sure. I'll ask a question. I guess. I mean, I have a number of questions, and maybe some of the philosophical background could be drawn out. I mean, in some sense, what's interesting is in the critique of the passage to the act, it seems like you're in some sense giving greater weight to actually the existential actually references within the seminar. So I mean Kierkegaard, but Heidegger in particular, and that in some sense the criticism of this moment of passage to the act or suicide, which you could say is the identification of structure and void. And just to maybe add another question, I'm wondering if that's not also precisely an evasion of the problem of the unary trait. I mean, in some sense that it identifies, it collapses structure and void, and therefore results in indifference. But at the same time, then the moment of suicide or that act is the consignment of the subject to gravity as such, quite literally, with the sort of letting oneself fall. In other words, to necessity, right? That there is nothing other than the void of which I cannot differentiate myself, and therefore, you know, I'll become one with it. You know, which is also has a philosophical lineage that I think, you know, is, you know, which then also touches on how I understood your criticism of lack as being also a critique of basically, in a different terminology, of determinate negation. And so a kind of Hegelian, you know, reading of you know, let's say of the problem of anxiety. So okay, so where is the I guess maybe I'm losing where the question was in this re-narration. Yeah. Maybe I'll do, if it comes to, I mean, yeah, maybe you can just start and then, yeah.
There's a lot of stuff. I mean, last point you made, I mean, yes, one of my critical targets were those Lacanians, most Lacanians, who read this idea of what happens in anxiety as a lack of lack. So very simple double negation. You have negation, lack of lack, absence of absence. It gives you something positive. And that something positive, you could even say, would be the alleged absolute object. So a reattachment with the lost object, to simplify, more generally psychoanalytical jargon, the phallus, blah, 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 right? Of course, even these critics do not say this is what we want in analysis, because actually that alleged reattachment is the dissolution of the subject, right? But I think this is still a lingering reading, even in sophisticated readers. So philosophically speaking, what one is trying to do here, I'm trying to do, is providing like a materialist theory of the signifier. If you instead like speak of lack of lack turning into something, which is the thing, you're deep into substantialism, if not vitalism, really. However distracted that may be. That's one philosophical connection. The other philosophical connection, if I got you right, I agree with you. In a sense, the critique of the passage to the act is implicitly, there are very few passages on Heidegger and Kierkegaard in seminar time that there are, it is implicitly also a critique of a certain crass understanding, existentialist understanding of anxiety, which is not Heidegger, which is not even Kierkegaard, but someone like Camus, for instance. I'm really jumping here myself. I think like Lacan is saying, you know, like a kind of like second-hand existentialism, which is not Heidegger. Heidegger is Heidegger somehow. You know, this profound respect for Lacan, even though disagree. But confounding anxiety with the passage to the act clinically is in a sense a repetition of the philosophical mistake of understanding disalienation or freedom, if you want also to simplify more, with precisely this idea of attempted suicide, in a sense, you know, like that would be the quick philosophical connection.
That reminded me of the question that I had. So I mean, which was precisely then the issue of having to differentiate or think a concept, I mean, a notion of freedom. That I think you hinted at maybe with appropriation of anxiety. That would be different than the only free act is precisely the acceptance of necessity, the absolute necessity of death, for example, so suicide. And so then the question that I this was the other question, why I sort of added the addendum about the unary trait, because I'm wondering if, I mean, because you were describing the passage of the act as the fixation of the void, but yeah, but I'm curious whether there wouldn't be another. I mean, because precisely the moment of the passage to the act is also the moment in which any kind of potential symbolization any attachment to the signifier is also sacrificed, right? In a moment that then will sacrifice both one's attachment to the symbolic as well as then, one's relation to the imaginary, and one just simply becomes identified with the void as such, so that, but yeah, okay, no. So I guess it seems like there has to be there's some other option, between, on the one hand, that merely anxiety is a defense versus, then the passage to the act, and that would actually nonetheless be, in some sense, attached to the fragment of the letter. Is where, so that one can actually differentiate what is, on the level of passage of the act remains undifferentiated or purely, the void as such, so to speak. But yeah.
You go back to basically the question of the proximity, the structural proximity between anxiety and the passage to the act. And I think this is the point we're discussing with Jean as well. That is to say, there is a suspension of the very division between the unconscious and subconsciousness, which potentially has catastrophic consequences in terms of the dissolution of the subject or practically jumping off a bridge, right? But that suspension of structure, if you want to put it like that, is different in the two, anxiety and the passage to the act. In a sense, in anxiety, you see, honestly, up to a certain point, because then there's a defense, you see what structure is, and the relation between the subject and structure as such. Structure, fundamentally, retroactively at least, is simple. It's not chains of signifiers. That will have been. It is marks. And here also, Lacan is not revolutionizing Freud. One can go back and find the role of Zeichen, and there's a lot of stuff in Freud already, right? But on the other hand, in the passage to the act, you do have, in a sense, a subjective identification with the object that it dissolves structure itself, because it enacts the contiguity between, let's say, language and the void, and takes it to the level of an identification. It's getting more complex, but the political question or ethical question is crucial, and yes. What I presented today, we found the following part. This is like a section of a chapter of a part of the book I'm writing. If you're not continuing on what I hinted at, this idea of the appropriation of what emerges in anxiety, then yes, this is like a conservative, ethically and politically stance, right? Because you are invoking defenses against the passage to the act. But there's more to it. Yeah.
I think there may be a last question here in the first row. Or a very last question here behind by Leonard. By Rachel.
Oh,
okay.
Is that okay? I am clearly not a Lacanian, but I want to ask you, when does the Heimlich become unheimlich? And let's get real. I mean, this is very important, I think, and I'm concerned about in some ways, the nature of, there's something that you're talking about that's really important that has to do with alienation and an exaggerated experience of self-consciousness and anxiety in the face of indifference. That seems really critical. That's not just ontological. That's not just the birth of self-consciousness or the gap or the void. That is a death object that is entering the scene of the child, such that what should be Heimlich in terms of the relationship of the body to the psyche becomes unheimlich and self-conscious. And then an intervention has to happen. We need to, find the story. I think I'm agitated because.
But Rachel, take the microphone, please.
Oh, I just said. Yeah. I think I'm agitated because we are losing something very important about where we intervene, and I think what you say about anxiety and indifference and desire, and when a person becomes no longer at home in their own body and a fracture takes place is important to locate in a story, and both internally and externally.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure I understand what we are supposed to be
Losing from this Lacanian perspective, because I think we are not, and actually, turn the doubt on I would turn it around. I think like this is the only kind of theory which enables a practicing analyst to operate on concrete issues such as anxiety, or up to the level of like general phrases such as panic attack. I'm not sure on this. I mean, I have an answer. This is interesting. Very much appreciate that you invited people from very different orientations in psychoanalysis. So this is a really rare dialogue, I think, for me. But I have an answer on the question of Unheimlich and Heimlich. But I don't see what is the question about like over usual concern by non-Lacanians. Do you think like this is like a too abstract theory in order to put it into practice to simplify, or is there like because it's not an ontological point, but so what are we losing according to your opinion?
The nature of the anxiety. What is the anxiety signaling?
Yeah.
What is the danger that is the anxiety is signaling? If there is a double absence, then there needs to be an acknowledgement of the absence, or it will remain a double absence.
Yeah, no, but there is an answer. Thank you for clarifying. I mean, we are not losing anything insofar as, in my opinion, what anxiety is signaling, to put it simply, and I think this is quite uncontroversial for Lacanians, is the excessive proximity of the desire of the other, the other's desire. The danger of the void, I think, was it in Cecilia's presentation, you briefly mentioned the idea of, like, there was a Lacan reference about desire of the other. I mean, it's eliciting the subject, what do you want? This is crucial in Lacanian theory. So, the desire of the other, if you want to put it more psychoanalytically, elicits a subject-inducing questioning, which is never answered. And then we cannot build on that more theoretically and speak of a danger of the void, but we are talking about the same thing. So the immediate connection there would be to say anxiety signals a excessive proximity of the other's desire, which may have potentially catastrophic consequences for the subject, but at the same time, to go back to the point we were trying to single out with Alexi, could also have potentially emancipatory, to use like a very general term, consequences. So it's at the end of the day, we are talking about how structure is a structure structured around a subject which is only such as an object in relation to a desire of the other that cannot be mitigated. And the only way to mitigate it is for the subject, basics of Lacanian theory, to be in the place of the other's desire, qua object. So, and again, this is fantasy. So this is both a defense, but it's unacceptable. That is to say, I am an object, hence repressed, primal repression. Anxiety disturbs that structure. Mm-hmm. And it could go both ways, in a sense, to really simplify.
Okay.
I hope I managed to provide some answer.
The last thing, and I do think we need to stop, is with Heimlich and Unheimlich. There's also in German the...
Jean, take the
There's
microphone,
also
please.
in German the expression heimgesucht. So she was she was claimed. I'm thinking again of the homosexual patient. She was how would I say this, heimgesucht? She would be claimed by the home, by the proximity, as you would say, of the fulfillment of her desire. The desire came too close, and it happened to happen in front of her Heim. So this heimgesucht has also something very uncanny to it.
Yeah, but very quickly, going back to Rachel's question, because I didn't answer the Unheimlich thing. In a sense, Lacan is saying the Unheimlich is the Heim, so the, as per Freud, I mean, it's a Urwort, right? So what is homely is also the opposite of it. And this is what is the kernel of the unconscious. But it is, of course, repressed because that is what cannot be accepted in terms of what we were saying earlier. The subject is such only by making themselves the object for the desire of the other. So what appears in anxiety is our Heim, which is unheimlich and as such repressed. And hence anxiety disturbs the fact that our Heim cannot be recognized for what it is, which is the unheimlich. And very last point, but this was also thanks to my students, like we spent like a year reading Seminar 10. This is not something which Lacanians, to the best of my knowledge, have singled out sufficiently, this Freudian connection, that what the fundamental fantasy is for Lacan, that is to say, the kernel of the unconscious is fundamentally Unheimlichkeit. He's talking in terms of quasi-synonyms, and it's not been fleshed out sufficiently.
Yes, so there had been a question before by Leonard, but
I just quickly commented on the phrase panic attack, just to remind us that its roots in panic has its roots in Greek myths pertaining to Pan, the god of nature, there are many different versions of the story, but he's essentially rejected by his mother, embraced by his father, Hermes. But when Pan is feeling very upset about whatever he's upset about, he retreats to a cave and he lets out a blood-curdling cry that causes panic in everyone that hears it. So we have phrases like pandemic and so on, which mean everyone is affected by it. So I think there's just something, I know it's not a technical word, panic attack, but it's a really interesting mythopoetic word, pan, because of its roots in this God rejected by his mother.
Yeah, and also generally pan is like
Everywhere, everywhere. All, everywhere. Everyone hears this.
So that's also interesting, and I want to elaborate on that and say, in a sense, like the philosophers, analysts I was criticizing and bringing them up again in dialogue with Alexei earlier, precisely those who take the lack of lack, the absence of absence, induced or inducing also anxiety as the manifestation of something, of a pan, potentially. The thing with a capital T, right? Whether this is like embraced in a kind of post-Deleuzian vitalism plus Lacan or rejected, that doesn't matter. That I see as an impasse, like remaining on the level of double negation. Negation is, clearly Freudian concept, but it's also obviously a philosophical concept. It's a question of like thinking double negation in a much more sophisticated manner than minus plus minus equal plus, or two minuses equal one plus. And I think that's profoundly simplistic, if not dangerous, both philosophically, but I suppose also clinically in a sense.
My second question was about Kojet's analysis of Hegel's master-slave relationship and its relation to what you said, but I'm going to forego that.
So,
would you like to take the chance and ask the real last question?
Thank you. I renounce because I have about 10 questions. And I cannot decide what is the most important here. But thank you very much. I can, maybe otherwhere we can discuss.
Let me join you in thanking everybody.
Thank you.
Lorenzo.
Thank you.
All of you, the speakers, and also you, a marvelous audience. You gave us so much to think about, and I think it was really an extremely inspiring conference. Thank you. We will stay in touch. The lectures will be on our YouTube channel soon, so you have the chance to re-listen and re-see the lectures. Thank you again. Let's call it a night. Let's call it a day. Let's call it a night.
Will it be possible to get hard copies of some of the presentations?
This is something I need to check with the speakers, because some papers will maybe be published anyhow soon. Maybe you send me an email in the next week and I have an answer.
Cecilia's is published.
Yeah, Cecilia's is published, that's right, yeah. So, thank you again, and have a wonderful Saturday night.